Hello, I'm going to talk about building a culture of self-evaluation in a class for pre-service teachers of English. Here's the slide which I used to introduce the topic of assessment to my students. But in this video, I'll try to talk a little bit more about how I used my own experience and the gap between my students and me to try to change their viewpoints about using tests only as the way of assessment. So my big question about this is this a culture issue, actually? I think there was a big contrast between the students' classroom experience and mine. My class had about 11 students, of whom only 2 or 3 would really speak out with any great regularity. And especially if one student was absent, then everything changed a lot and people talked a whole lot less. People had come to rely on one student who was somewhat fluent, very confident, had a lot of experience of teaching English in a juku. And so even though there was another student who had probably a higher level of ability, one confident person was kind of accepted as the person who was going to be the spokesperson for the group. My feeling was, and this was reinforced by what came out later on, that all of the students had been evaluated by tests a lot, and none of the students were terribly confident, including the person who was speaking out and risk-taking. Actually, all of them at times criticized their own English a lot, even with a TOEIC score of 900, and expressed the feeling in their journal that they were not very good at English, even if they thought they were doing kind of okay on a particular task. So let's look at this culture thing. This is my attempt at looking at the connections between your evaluation practices and your classroom practice and kind of beliefs about education. I did my postgraduate certificate in education at the Institute of Education in London in about 1990. And at that time, people were just getting going with educational profiling. So you would see the skill profile of speaking, listening, reading, writing, and raise awareness that you could be very good at one skill and not very good at another skill, and that you could be multilingual. So you might be speaking 3 languages fluently, but actually English was a new language. And so you weren't speaking English fluently. So that culture was very influenced by the CEFA. During my teacher training, we didn't have tests at all. We did everything by assignment and portfolio, continuous assessment. So I told my students this, and it was quite interesting how much they were kind of putting that on one side as like, this is not like us. And it took conversations over another 3 or 4 weeks and bringing in another teacher who was an assistant teacher who had experienced university education in UAE and also had knowledge about university education in the world in various other places, being a graduate student at our university. And it took her saying, yeah, I made portfolios, I was assessed by portfolio as well, to really kind of change the students' ideas about what might be acceptable, even though some of them had had very negative experiences of the university entrance exam testing system. So historically, Japan is known as a place which has had a hierarchical kind of testing and terrifically competitive university entrance exams. And that's only beginning to change now a little bit as the use of listening and speaking is changing the university entrance system a bit, and the also availability of university places is certainly making it easier to get into a university, but actually the use of testing is still quite widespread for those competitive elite universities. So I'll talk now a little bit more about assessment for learning. So here on my slide, you can see assessment is part of learning. And this has been a radical movement since the 1990s in UK education that I've experienced, where we want to let students know you're going to be assessed on this particular thing, and you're assessed on various different components, and you can get feedback on your performance so that you can do better next time. So the assessment should be very transparent, and it should be very related to the context. Probably the idea of progress is going to be very important. And so the idea of a criterion reference test may be less important than the idea of feedback and improving, making one step along. Norm reference test is not going to help completely. A norm reference test means we're looking at the average for that class. And again, I would rather have some criteria which are achievable, and then let students feel that they're progressing in relation to the goals that they set, to the criteria that they have some degree of power over choosing. So that's very much part of the idea of assessment for learning. And it's also part of creating a dialogue around our learning. It's interesting to see that now we can get a lot more objective feedback with AI, and students can also do the product. So if we try to have a product-driven approach to assessment and say, okay, we're going to evaluate your essay, students can actually beat us at our own game by pressing a button and producing an essay. So this idea of a dialogic culture around learning and assessment needing to be context sensitive and context driven is actually going to be something we see more in the future. But of course, there is a tension between the context dependent aspects and objectivity. So when portfolios were being really looked at in Asia, apparently there was some research on whether business leaders in Hong Kong wanted to see portfolios and see the work that their students were going to say they're capable of when they come to find a job. And actually the employers said, no, we just want a number. So there's obviously a kind of tension between convenience and actual sensitivity to a context. So for my students in my classroom in Japan, I felt that practicing self-evaluation would change them, because they might break up their kind of negative idea about their own English to turn it into, I need to focus more on this. I can have this goal. I'm still quite good at this, and make it connected to their needs. So they needed to have a chance to understand more about how they were being evaluated and connect that. So that's why I've got identity on there. And that's why I see a connection with willingness to speak out in a classroom. Because when you speak out in the classroom, your identity is at risk either as a person who's seen as being terrifically competent and therefore untouchable and responsible for being perfect, or as somebody who's not really good enough to be interesting, and who is not a contender at all. So there are many ways in which the microculture, the classroom culture, which is built up in a particular group which spend time together and develop their own group dynamic, that microculture is going to affect self-evaluation, and that's going to affect how much people will feel comfortable to communicate. And having a kind of invisible black box of test score can have a negative effect on that classroom culture, and having transparent evaluation where people get the feedback immediately and they know that they're being evaluated in relation to what's actually happened in the classroom, events that they remember, may have a positive effect on their identity as a good learner. So for teachers or prospective teachers, that could be very important. So I'm now going to show you a bit of my PowerPoint, which I showed to students, which was to ask them to think about assessment and to kind of problematize assessment by objective testing. And I gave them a video of this because I thought they might need to study some of the vocabulary after the class. So we had a little discussion about the kind of assessments that they might have experienced so far. And I tried to put in some vocabulary terms for them there. And then they had this to take home and look at. And this idea of an assessment package was something I wanted them to raise their awareness of, that an assessment which results in a grade at the end of term is probably going to have multiple components. So that's what I'm calling an assessment package. It's very likely that teachers have some input into the assessment package, but they're not in control entirely of it. So my activity, which I did with students about this, was a role play where I asked them to role play 3 different kinds of teacher, and each teacher had a different view of assessment, which I told them what it had to be. So there's one teacher who thought that reading and writing were the most important, another who thought that speaking and listening was the most important. I don't remember the other one. But it was set up so that they would have to conflict with each other. And it was really, really interesting that they very typically kind of massaged the view that they had to represent to suit their own view. So all of the groups ended up with a composite which prioritized some listening and speaking as well as reading and writing. Let's go to my next slide. So I was kind of walking them through the vocabulary there, and then the idea of test justice, which of course they know very well, and then trying to open up the idea that a test, some testable activities could be group work, and the idea of a portfolio. Now, my thing that I could have done better on this course was introduce portfolios from the get-go. So I'm now doing a second iteration of the course, and I gave them my first year's students' portfolios with permission for the students to look at the very first class. And they were so interested and so relieved to think that they would get a chance to do portfolio assessment. So that I gave them this so they could study a little bit more about it. And the idea that they would be doing continuous assessment. And then by the time we got to peer assessment, there was just so much for them to think about and discuss that I didn't really have enough time to go deeply into that. I decided that I would spend most of the time on me giving them assessment because I felt they would be quite tough with each other. So I didn't really go bigly into peer assessment in this iteration. And the other thing that I would like to do, and I'm now doing on the second time of teaching my teacher trainees English skills component, is to explicitly teach them about the SEFA and to start using can-do lists very early on. So in the last week, I've handed over can-do lists to my students and asked them to go and look at the ones that they think would be relevant for junior high or senior high, depending on the level that they want to teach, and also to highlight anything that they don't really understand what it is, or anything that they think is very easy for them. So we're trying to get towards goal setting. And again, this is my vocabulary for my students and my attempt to negotiate with them about what we would do. So this was introduced in about week 4 of last fall's class in academic speaking, which was speaking for students who want to be teachers for second years. And so then I dropped my bombshell on them that in my teacher training, everything was done by portfolio. So there were observations and self-evaluations. And so raising the idea of what is fair was part of that. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you'll drop by my poster and think a lot in your own practice about the relationship between culture, classroom culture, and testing methodologies. And such interesting research is coming from Stephen Heine in the United States, for example, that Oriental students, Asian students were motivated by failure on a test. They set up a test in which students would automatically fail, not determined by their effort, but just for the pragmatics of the test. And then they measured which students would continue on the next part of the test. And some of the American students just kind of walked out in a huff, and the non-American students continued to try till the end of the time limit. So that suggests this kind of link between culture. I think there's also research showing that Japanese students will introject negative feedback and both consider it and make some use of it potentially, but also introject it into negative self-image. So the idea that there are cultural elements to assessment is not completely proven, but very interesting to be aware of. Thank you for listening.